years. And before that, I was a global practice lead for PCI DSS for BSI, where I was a QSA for more years than I care to admit. And joining us today, we have Sean Crowley, who is a QSA in good standing and director in Secora Consulting. So he should provide some interesting insights as to what's going on the ground from the QSA perspective. And then we have Shane, who is the CEO of Evervault, also an engineer, so should be able to give us some good insights from the engineer's point of view in terms of what a good 643 and 1161 might look like and what the challenges might be. So to kick us off, after that, just a brief look at the agenda here, we'll talk about PCI DSS version 4, where it's come from, where we are now, and what the changes have been. We'll briefly touch on SAQA and its applicability and why it's important. Then we'll do a bit of a deep dive into 643 and 1161, understand what they are, where their applicable scope is. And then we'll look at some attack vectors and some practical challenges and solutions when implementing controls for 643 and 1161. And then we'll have some conclusions, wrap up, and a brief demo. But if anybody has any questions along the way, do feel free to type into the questions box. It's kind of one in from the very right-hand side if you have any questions. And we have some engineering folks ready to answer some questions. And if there's anything PCI DSS specific, we could jump in as we go as well. Okay, so PCI DSS version 4. I think it's safe to say that it's been on the horizon for quite some time. It was version 4 was first released in 2022, Q1 2022. And at that point, I guess quite a lot of people got an understanding of what it looked like. It's fairly different from PCI DSS version 3, in that it offered a lot more flexibility, was more outcome focused as opposed to being very prescriptive. Although if you had a high level of compliance with version 3, there was a really tight mapping. But we knew since 2022 that there was going to be some new controls in there. Skip along 2022 and 2023, we get to the early stages of first quarter 2024, and version 3.2.1 is retired. Everybody attesting compliance last year, post April 1st, I guess, had to be compliant with PCI DSS version 4. And so in that transition window from 2022 to 2024, people either went one of two ways, certainly in my experience. They did the usual route for moving compliance, which is understand where you were, gap analysis against what the new requirements are, put a plan together, implement the controls, and hey presto, you'll be PCI DSS version 4 compliant. Some other organizations took the opportunity to reevaluate the way they were processing card data. And a lot of organizations, instead of making that big transition to version 4, went down the road of actually saying, okay, I'm going to leverage what are some maybe existing or well understood patterns to remove card data from their environments, either using things like network tokenization, network tokens, encryption, using third-party service providers to use iframes. So basically they just got card data out of their environment. So two kind of different approaches along the way to achieving compliance. In 2024 anyway, Q1, sort of 1st of April, V4 becomes mandatory. Towards the end of 2024 and starting in 2025, we know that any net new controls were going to become mandatory. So those are, we have a 2-year grace window to transition from PCI version 3 to PCI version 4, and an extra year pretty much to implement the brand new controls. And it seems to be, that's where some people started realizing where SAQA was going to give us a bit of trouble. And we'll deep dive into that a little bit more and why SAQA is so important. But lo and behold, we're in Q1 2025 now. The new controls are coming to light. SAQA is being revised quite heavily. Shane, you might flick on to the next slide there. And we're seeing lots of kind of upset in the PCI DSS global kind of landscape. I think it's worth understanding why PCI self-assessment questionnaire A is so important in the overall PCI DSS context. And it's really organizations who try to de-scope their environments so that they minimize the cost of becoming PCI compliant and the risk really of a card breach can leverage a kind of bunch of exceptions to say you no longer have to fill out the complete PCI DSS ROC or SAQD document if you process card data in a specific way. And that specific way is to basically outsource all card processing to PCI DSS compliant service providers. And that basically, by de-risking your environment and getting rid of that card data, plain text card data in your environment, you de-risk card breach. And so what the PCI Council did was put SAQA together, which put some basic security controls in place. Like you're talking maybe 30 odd in PCI version 4 versus way over 250 for SAQD. So there's a real, SAQA is kind of the panacea of achieving PCI DSS compliance because you de-risk your environment. The level of effort to achieve SAQA is a lot more achievable than SAQD. It costs less money, and I guess you can focus on what you're really trying to achieve as a business, certainly in engineering, by having less PCI DSS controls to fulfill. So that kind of brings us into the timeline with SAQA and where all the changes have happened. So SAQA that aligned with the new version of PCI version 4 was released in July 2023. I think most people who had been following it quite closely will be aware that the new controls, specifically 643 and 1161, were designed to kind of try and reduce the risk of client-side script attacks. So it had been in there since July. We saw the first version of SAQA in July. I think at that stage, a lot of people weren't too worried about it because it was probably the security community or the payment security people who were going, okay, it looks okay. We'll get an inventory, we'll implement CSP and we'll implement SRI and we should be fine. We'll worry about that when it gets closer to 2025. And then I guess in 2024, people started to take a bit more notice as we come closer to the Q1 deadline 2025. And industry feedback, still kind of unclear what the industry feedback is to date. Certainly approached the council, or the council started to feel this industry feedback, and changes started to happen with SAQA. I guess the big one, or one came out in October 2024, where SAQA still includes requirements 643 and 1161. And there is a small kind of change to make SAQA realign with PCI DSS 4.0.1, which was a bit of a change to the overall document. And we got some clarification in that document to say that full page redirects were not in scope for 643 and 1161. Roll on to January 2025, and we see another change to SAQA. So we've got version 4.0.1 or1, and this was kind of a big one because it removed requirements 643 and 1161 and 1231 from the actual SAQA document. There was kind of certainly through the cat amongst the pigeons for a lot of organizations who had been working to solve those issues, for a lot of people who had invested time and money in implementing the various controls to satisfy those. And so in removing 643 and 1161 from SAQA as actual controls to satisfy, a statement went in around about satisfying eligibility criteria to actually be able to use SAQA. And that basically said the site shouldn't be susceptible to script-based attacks. And you had to check that box in order for you to be eligible to use SAQA. So lots of questions, lots of pushback to the council. And then we are into February 2025. A new FAQ 1588 is published by the council, and it basically infers that to achieve that eligibility criteria, you either have to implement controls that satisfy 643 and 1161, so effectively putting it back in scope, or you obtain some assurance from your iframe provider that says if the iframe is implemented in line with a secure deployment guide, and they give you the okay, that it's okay to tick that eligibility criteria box. Since then, and only on Monday, we've had a new information supplement that's come out. Again, trying to further clarify where 11.6.1 and 643 are applicable to merchants, service providers, the different types of models, the expected outcomes that you should be able to demonstrate to your auditor when it comes time to demonstrate compliance to 11.6.1, 643, or indeed the eligibility criteria for SAQA. And that's been the sequence of events literally right up until Monday, when that last piece of guidance information supplement was published. That is available on the PCI Security Council's website as well for anybody who wants to have a deeper read. And of course, in 21 days, these requirements become mandatory. So lots of fun and games to be had between now and then. Sean, I think I covered that in a bit of detail. Any kind of different perspectives from your side on that one?
I think that covers it off, John. In the main, I think you did a pretty good job there. One thing I will say, probably from my perspective as a QSA, maybe at the coal face of it, is, or maybe it's something that the council can maybe learn from going forward, is the communication plan around some of these things going forward. I think needs to be better, particularly for these requirements. Realistically speaking, the two requirements that we're talking about today, so 643 and 11.6.1, even though I got access to early versions of the new PCI standard before it came out, when there was the request for comments and that kind of stuff from QSAs, it didn't particularly stand out to me as standout issues, I guess. But not being a developer, that's probably expected. I'm not 100% sure why it would have. And it was only really about a year ago, a client of mine raised the issue with me during an audit that they were doing, because they were preparing at that stage to get ready for these two particular requirements. That has kind of cropped up that it was problematic. And then as I was kind of working, number one, with them and doing a bit of research offline, and maybe bringing it back to other QSAs to get their opinion on it. What we've kind of had is almost a year of really vague answers to a lot of questions, certainly from the QSA's perspective as well, in terms of solutions that can actually work. So from my perspective, talking to security teams and development teams and that kind of stuff, multiple eyebrows were raised. It kind of, I think, felt from their perspective that, I think from the council's perspective, to de-risk it, they want to reduce the number of scripts on pages, and that's fine, ultimately. But I think in kind of modern applications and single page applications that are there these days, it's not as kind of straightforward to do that, and there's probably serious business implications to trying to force a square peg into a round hole just to meet particular kind of PCI requirements, and this is where a lot of that stuff has kind of been coming up from my point of view. Now, when the initial announcement came back in November about the the information supplement coming out in Q1, I think that potentially put the brakes on a lot of people that had been doing work prior to that, because they probably assumed that early Q1 was going to be, not 2 or 3 weeks before the actual deadline of the requirements coming in. It was maybe thought it might be January or something like that. And from what I've seen in a lot of the solutions that people are coming up with, whether they're trying to do them internally or whether they're outsourcing them, there's significant cost implications to that, and the information that was passed out about the information supplement coming out in Q1 meant, I think, for a lot of people that they were afraid of pulling the trigger on decisions that they may have made earlier, because they were afraid of getting it wrong and having, the potential implications of that, and then not being compliant with the controls once the information supplement provided extra guidance. On top of that, I think the change to SAQA, as you mentioned at the start as well, probably added further doubt as to what the intentions of the council would be in coming up to the deadline, and whether or not they would say, well, if they've done it for SAQA, maybe that means they'll give an extension, or they'll, for the deadline, or they'll do something to make it easier to comply with. Certainly at this stage, it doesn't look like anything like that is going to happen at this stage. But I think that particular communication plan, from what I've seen at the coalface, has probably caused more issues than anything else.
I think calling it an actual communication plan is probably giving it a bit too much credit, to be honest. Because I don't think there's any planning at all.
Yeah, and look, I can see as well that, look, there's probably a lot of work that has to go in the background to the information supplements and that kind of stuff that do come out. So it's probably not as straightforward as just, they probably want to make sure it is right before it comes out. But I think I think it's probably just, people that are on the call will probably be able to attest to this. I think the confusion around a lot of the lack of clarity around a lot of stuff in relation to these two requirements has actually slowed people down, the way that the messaging has kind of come out over the past couple of months. And now we're 2 or 3 weeks from the deadline, and I think people are, maybe Monday's information supplement has provided a bit more clarity, but people are probably now closer to actually being ready for these requirements on April 1st than they would have been back, in Q3 or Q4 last year.
Yeah, I wonder, having dealt with a few acquirers in the past and their kind of compliance teams, they will be well aware of what's going on here. And I think there's probably an angle that people can kind of explore with the acquirers to say, look, everybody knows that this was a gigantic mess. We have a plan in place and we're executing the plan over a period. And once you agree that with your acquirer and your QSA, it feels like you might get a bit more leniency. But again, I think it just comes down to having those conversations proactively with your acquiring bank and your QSA. And if you're a service provider, I guess, definitely with your QSA and perhaps the brands. Yeah. But I agree. I think getting developers and engineers involved too late in this process, I think it's probably what brought up a lot of the actual implementation issues as well. I think we'll deep dive into a bit of that later on, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So in this next slide here, what we tried to do is break down where the controls apply and to what kind of entity. So in PCI DSS, there are two primary entities. You're either a merchant or you're a service provider or you're both at a very high level. And what we've tried to do here is kind of on the very left-hand side, and put down the different kind of models that we've been talking about, or that where script security is important. So we've got using a third-party iframe, using a full-page redirect, writing your own kind of checkout where you're taking card data using scripts yourself, and using an iframe as a level 1 merchant. And then on the right-hand side, we have service providers. Service providers is a bit clearer, I guess, because service providers are not strictly allowed complete an SAQA, but there are obviously, and there was a lot of FAQs during the year around service providers using eligibility criteria for determining controls. So we can dive into that a bit, but I think we'll start off with the merchants using a third-party iframe. And you'll probably notice down the left-hand side of this slide, there are a lot of asterisks beside some explanations here. But for merchants using a third-party iframe, I guess your options are, and that iframe is being served from a level 1 PCI DSS compliant service provider. You can achieve, or you can use SAQA, but you've either got to, as I mentioned earlier, get that assurance from your iframe provider, or you implement controls to satisfy 643 and 1161. For a full page redirect, it appeared to be clearer in one of the SAQs that organizations who are using a full page redirect just don't have to do 1161 and 643. However, in the information supplement that came out on Monday, it appears that organizations who are doing full page redirects can only kind of avoid doing 643 and 1161 if the redirects are implemented server side as opposed to being implemented on the client side using scripts. So if you're doing a full page redirect using scripts, you have to be able to satisfy 643, 1161, or get some assurance from your service provider. In-house checkouts are going to be in scope for 643 and 1161. And you're typically going to have to fill out an SAQD or a ROC anyway, because you're actually responsible for the whole checkout experience. And if you're using scripts there, it may well be that you're using your own first-party scripts for managing that, or someone else's third-party scripts to aid in the process. The reason I put a level 1 service provider in here, as well as those doing just a self-assessment. For a merchant, it's typically anybody under 6 million for self-assessment, above 6 million transactions for a level 1 or a ROC for a merchant. There are some FAQs that kind of deep dive into whether you can use eligibility criteria to descope some controls from a report on compliance, or a ROC as it's known. And the FAQs say you can actually use eligibility criteria to descope controls. But I guess, again, that will be a conversation with your acquiring bank and your QSA as to whether that's applicable in your scenario. If I put my acquiring risk management hat on, I would say any level 1 merchant is highly likely going to be mandated to have some level of protection against malicious scripts where they're using an iframe. But again, certainly worth understanding whether that's going to be the case with your acquiring bank. And so for the same 4 models for a service provider, I don't think there's any getting away from 643 and 1161 for any of the models we just discussed. And even for the full page redirect, if you're a service provider using full page redirect, it's definitely worth talking to your brands and your QSA about that if it's implemented on the server side. Sean, any thoughts or takeaways on that kind of model, or any feelings of something different?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed the same thing when I was reading page 12 of the information supplement about the full page redirects. I guess like one of the things I'm anticipating getting asked questions about, I suppose, for some of the smaller merchants and that kind of stuff that I deal with, is like what constitutes the PSP assurance. And yeah, I mean, there was an element when when that guidance came out initially, and like I was probably as guilty as anyone, skim reading it, going, "That's grand. It's out for SAQA," because you know, why wouldn't it be? You know, it's very unlikely a lot of small merchants are going to be able to implement this. But then that extra criteria about the merchant being able to confirm that the page isn't susceptible to script attacks. From the SAQA point of view, like effectively the same mechanisms, I suppose, are what would need to be implemented in order to meet the requirements directly anyway. The whole thing about talking to your, you know, third-party service provider who's providing the iframe to, you know, see if they're, you know, if we implement it in the way that you've suggested, that you're, you know, happy that it's not going to be susceptible to those attacks. Suggest to me, similar to some solutions that I've seen around protected iframes and that kind of stuff that have been offered, that maybe the PSPs like, you know, Stripe and Global Payments and that kind of stuff will look eventually to implement. And some of those include things like, you know, protections against script or iframe hijacking or iframe overlays and all of this kind of good stuff. And that may happen down the line. At the moment, there are some other service providers out there that are providing those solutions for other organizations as part of a customized approach. What I would suggest, anyone that is going down that route, it's probably a good idea to talk about it with your QSA, because the ones that I've seen thus far, it's so that what they've suggested that the solution is doing in these kind of protected iframes is more marketing kind of material from what I've seen at the moment, and I'm sure they work fine and all that kind of stuff in the background, but at the end of the day, your QSA is probably going to say, if you've used this customized approach, how are you going to prove that it is actually doing what it says it's doing? And maybe one of the solutions around that might be penetration testing against those specific elements that are common to scripts within iframes. And maybe that could be something as well that SAQA merchants could look to as well, to add that extra validation, because they've no requirement in SAQA to do penetration testing. It might be a way to help prove that the implementation isn't actually susceptible, which would be more than likely accepted by a QSA in those circumstances. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some open questions there about how that's going to look kind of down the line as we get past, you know, the 1st of April, and going forward. But at a high level, that's my thoughts on it at the moment from an implementation perspective.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Still, I wonder whether the third-party service providers are going to open themselves up to any kind of risk by just giving out assurance handy. I think they're probably going to implement these kind of secure deployment guides, which include a level of monitoring anyway. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. Okay, so on to the next slide here, and the next couple of slides actually are just going to deep dive into what 643 and 1161 actually are. So at a very high level, 643 is saying scripts need to be authorized. So somebody needs to approve them, make sure that they're legit. We need to be able to verify the integrity of the script. So I think back in the early days, we would have said SRI, CSP is the man for the first one, SRI is the man for the second one, and then inventory is just gather all our scripts, try and minimize as much as we can, gather all our scripts, justify why they're there, and monitor for any changes to script kind of sources and the actual content of scripts. So the kind of thing you'd be expecting to see there, if I was still a QSA, I guess, is a policy that covers how script management occurs, how you're managing that end-to-end life cycle, the actual inventory itself. So where does the script come from? What's it for? When was it last reviewed? And a CSP configuration. So how are you actually implementing CSP? Is it just in reporting mode only? Are you actively blocking? And then I think for the integrity piece, I think realistically, we'll get into this a bit later on, but I don't think, and Sean, we were talking beforehand, I don't think there's too many organizations in this day and age who are going to be implementing SRI for third-party script management, because the risks are just too great.
Yeah. So my experience is when I've ever mentioned that in a room where there's engineers or anything like that, visibly notice blood pressure rising when you say SRI is the solution here. Certainly for that, like, look, it might work if the scripts are hosted locally and they're not changing and that kind of stuff. But realistically, there, in most applications, there's going to be some level of third-party dependencies there, and I guess in production applications, you can't really depend on having SRI and third-party scripts that could be changing either on a reasonably frequent basis or that are created dynamically or anything like that. So I don't see it as a unless it's very small kind of websites and that kind of stuff, I don't see it being a solution that's going to scale particularly well.
Yeah, Shane, as with your engineering hat on, what are your thoughts around SRI?
Yeah, I mean, to Sean's point, I think SRI is effectively equivalent to just embedding the entire script natively within the page itself, which makes sense if you're loading a 10 megabyte JavaScript file or something, which I guess increasingly is common these days. But in a lot of cases, it defeats the purpose of loading a third-party script in the first place. You're loading a third-party script for either efficiency reasons, where you want someone else to basically pay the CDN bill, or you're loading a third-party script because you want to allow them to change it. And then if they change it, everything breaks. You're either kind of pinning versions from the CDN, in which case you might as well just bundle it and serve it up locally. So yeah, you're right. And I think you see a lot of even payment processors now, we're just saying they're not even going to support SRI. Like, for example, Stripe, even as part of the new kind of recommendations around SRI that people have been making, they've just said, we change our script too frequently. I'm sure they're doing multiple releases a week. And if they had to get all of their merchants or service providers to either update the version or update the SRI checksums dynamically somehow, it's just a non-runner in the first place. So yeah, it works for some things, but not for small JavaScripts you might be using for a payment iframe or something similar.
Yeah, I do wonder to myself whether the likes of big players in the payment space like Stripe actually comprise a large amount of that industry feedback. And if Stripe are not playing ball by not providing SRI hashes, well, then it becomes pretty difficult to secure or use SRI for verifying the integrity for a lot of e-commerce sites across the internet. So I think the other way of doing it then is just by understanding what the script changes are. So looking at diffs, being able to identify when the changes occur, and applying a level of analysis over those diffs to pick out whether anything is any of the changes are actually malicious or not. I think that's probably the way we'll see things going. And the next one we're going to look at then is 11.6.1. And again, so we're looking at change control and tamper detection mechanisms here. So HTTP headers and script contents, usefully enough, although some of the perhaps suggested headers to look at in the information supplement were deprecated or don't appear to be supported by privacy preserving browsers like Brave. So while it gives a list of security headers that you might well monitor, it's probably not all encompassing or necessarily extremely up to date. But so it does give you a good place to start in terms of what security headers to be looking at in terms of those being changed and why. And then what this requirement also requires us to do is verify a frequency at which those changes will be reviewed. So it doesn't say we have to block things. based on a script header or a HTTP header changing, but we should be aware of these things and be able to react quickly. And so it says at least weekly on that slide. However, you can actually do a specific risk assessment and figure out how often you want to actually do those reviews. I think most people will be doing them at least weekly once they have that baseline established. So again, with this one, I guess what I would expect to see with my QSA hat on is a policy, how you handle those changes to HTTP headers and scripts, who's responsible for doing that, and under what circumstances, for example, an incident might be raised. You would have a configuration as to what your security headers should look like, and then you just basically diff off any changes that may occur there. And then there's an interview process, I guess, that the QSA would expect to undertake with whoever has been named as responsible for looking after the life cycle of script and HTTP header changes. So that one feels not too bad once you've got a system in place for identifying those changes to scripts and headers, and a kind of robust process for actually following up on those changes. Do you agree with that, Sean?
Yeah. I mean, the information supplement, I guess, one of the things that it didn't was speak about the advantages, I suppose, and disadvantages of each of the different types of controls, whether that's website monitoring or CSP or SRI. So from a non-technical perspective, I guess, when you're looking at it, it's useful to kind of be able to see, because I've been asked this question: if I just implement CSP, will that do? Do I have to implement SRI as well? So if you're not sure, it's useful to look at both of those examples of the advantages and disadvantages, because you can see reasonably easy then this is what this is not covering versus what it is. So yeah, that's something I would suggest anyone that's looking to implement it has a look at as well as part of the information supplement when they're putting this together. The approach, I guess, that I've kind of seen from dealing with customers is kind of varied. So some are going down the route of utilizing third parties to manage this kind of stuff for them directly, and that involves obviously in some cases maybe running an extra piece of JavaScript that's going to track all the scripts for you and do all the monitoring and alerting and all that kind of stuff, which seems to be a reasonably clean solution. But I guess the one caveat I will say is I haven't actually seen anyone that has actually implemented a specific solution. So they look good, from the visuals and marketing perspectives, but again, we go back to the communication issues and that sort of stuff. I think a lot of people have held back and pulling the trigger. And other companies are looking at, rolling their own solutions internally and perhaps rolling the dice when it comes to explaining some of those with their QSA during audits. And I can understand both approaches because from what I can understand, having a third-party solution for it can be reasonably expensive depending on the charging model. So some of them charge, for example, based on page loads and that kind of stuff, which, as you can probably imagine, will get quite expensive over time, especially if you're quite a high traffic website. So look, there's not a one size fits all solution, I don't think, for it. But yeah, what I'm kind of saying is there's kind of a mixed approach from customers out there at the moment, from some that want a cleaner solution and let someone else manage it, versus trying to roll their own and build their own infrastructure around it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, the next kind of couple of slides, we're just going to dig into, I guess, why this client-side protection is important. Shane, you're going to run us through some of the common attack vectors, and then the challenges around the modern stack?
Yeah. So, I mean, as complicated as it is, and it might seem this way, the PCI Council didn't introduce these new controls for no reason. If anybody reads TechCrunch or, Bleeping Computer or any of these kind of blogs where you're kind of understanding and learning more about data breaches, there have been a bunch of breaches in recent years in the kind of e-skimming domain. Basically, if you've got a payment page where a user is typing in their card details, malicious JavaScript somehow gets embedded in those pages. It siphons off those card details and then sends them to a third party. A lot of the attack vectors have shifted more towards the client side in recent years because, frankly, infrastructure and backend security has gotten much better. Engineering teams, SecOps teams know how to build this stuff well. So in terms of how bad code actually gets onto different sites, one interesting example, and I suppose on the conversation of content security policies, British Airways got breached a few years ago. Something like 400,000 cards were skimmed from their checkout page. And it was kind of a pretty complicated attack vector where there was a supply chain attack where a third-party JavaScript library called Modernizer was basically tampered to inject some malicious code. They registered baways.com as a brand new domain name, which looks legitimate to the human eye at least, but it was in fact a malicious website that was siphoning off cards on the side. CSP actually would have stopped that, at least for the most part, and they'd probably figure out some other way around it. But the three most common ways that malicious JavaScript actually makes its way to a payment page is either a supply chain attack where if you're running your own CDN or you're serving up your own JavaScript in your payment page, somebody gets access to your repository somehow, whether that's GitHub, whether it's an S3 bucket that you're actually serving this stuff from, or it could be kind of a slightly less resilient CDN provider that you're using that hasn't done their security patching. This is moderately common. I think the second one is definitely the most common and kind of most low-hanging fruit out of all the ways of actually getting malicious JavaScript onto a payment page, and it's account takeover. In a lot of cases, if you're using Cloudflare or even AWS, least privilege access control isn't implemented particularly well in a lot of cases, and anybody with access to the AWS account is subject to kind of the rubber hose attack where, if you get access to the AWS account, you can modify some JavaScript, sneak it in. But what's interesting about payment pages and websites generally versus infrastructure or backend software is that it's not just infrastructure engineers that are shipping changes. Most checkout pages these days have potentially dozens of scripts on there that are actually more feeding into marketing teams. So you've got things like Google Tag Manager, which is effectively a data breach waiting to happen in a lot of cases, where it's one script that you can just log into a dashboard and add whatever other JavaScript you want and just serve it up in the payment page. Account takeover is a massive risk there because you just go in, you click a few buttons, and all of a sudden you've got whatever arbitrary JavaScript that you want being served up there. And then the third one is honestly less common these days, but still a bit of a risk, especially with people running, I would say, legacy infrastructure or kind of less resilient software. Somebody manages to kind of breach a web server through some well-known exploit that might be on some OWASP list or something. But if you can kind of figure out some way of actually cracking the server from the outside, you can also kind of maliciously inject JavaScript that way. That's what things like ASV scans under PCI have been looking at over the last number of years, and they do a pretty good job of picking up on the most common vulnerabilities. But I think what's changed a lot is that now that people are using cloud service providers, people tend not to run their own cloud or CDN infrastructure as much now. So thankfully, this is less of a risk. So if you're being pragmatic about it, I would definitely look at number 1 and 2 as the main things to focus on mitigating. But the biggest thing there is just assuming that, they are easy to mitigate. And I think you should just sort of always take the approach that you have already been breached. And that's why these PCI requirements are in place, to alert you when changes do happen rather than just preventing them in the first place. So with some of the approaches that have been recommended by, I guess, both the council, QSAs, and the security community overall, namely CSP and SRI, I actually think CSP is a pretty good tool. One of the biggest restrictions that you can enforce is that JavaScript can send requests to third-party services that aren't on the approved list. So if you've got malicious JavaScript injected on the page, sure, it can kind of tamper with the forms and modify some of the behavior, but it can't just siphon off data to a third-party service. So I do think that's sort of the 80-20 on maybe not necessarily complying directly with the controls, but at least from a security hygiene perspective, be very rigorous about what scripts you're allowing and what endpoints you're allowed to send data to. SRI is the big problem though, and I kind of alluded to this earlier on. Scripts change all the time. Third-party services want the ability to basically update code in real time if they want to release a new feature or maybe patch a security vulnerability. They don't want version pinning for the scripts that are being served up. And then even if you are implementing some sort of process with SRI, what inevitably happens is even if you have the best runbook for releasing software, you're still going to kind of miss a few things. If there's a GitHub pull review that needs to be reviewed by 2 people, human error just kind of comes into the fold quite a lot here, and all it takes is one kind of rogue library addition that might kind of pass through code review pretty easily because it is a legitimate library. And if that gets popped, then yeah, it's not a pretty day for anybody involved. So some of the ways that you can, I guess, solve all of these problems is CSP, like I mentioned, I think is great, and everybody should today just go out and implement CSP wherever possible. Inventory and monitoring for change is kind of probably the trickiest out of the 2 controls to actually implement, at least in an automated way. Obviously, anybody can just build a spreadsheet with a list of scripts that they're serving and a justification, which when you're going through your audit might be enough to demonstrate that you've thought about this stuff. Secure HTTP headers, so just doing basic things like CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, which prevents JavaScript from sending data or sending requests to third-party services that don't permit it. And then kind of basic security hygiene stuff as well. So patching and MFA. And one of the reasons that I guess we're hosting this webinar is similar to what Sean was saying earlier on. We think the best solution to a lot of this stuff is ironically another JavaScript. So we have recently released a product into beta called Page Protection. It effectively acts like a CDN for scripts that are being served up in a payment page where it does change detection, it does automated inventory, and it does analysis on the security headers that are actually being served up on the payment page. So what I'm going to run you through is just a quick demo of how we're approaching it. And I think there's definitely a lot of companies that are thinking about it this way. You can either roll it yourself using things like SRI and CSP, or using a CDN approach. It definitely kind of speeds up the time to compliance. But yeah, there are pros and cons for sure, which I'll kind of talk about. So what we've got here is a sample payment page, which in this case is Everair, the world's leading airline. It's collecting card data using a payment iframe, and you'll see here that the page itself has a handful of third-party scripts. So we're using Hotjar in this case, which is a pretty popular tool for product teams to review user experience. The script is pretty complicated because it's actually dynamically injecting JavaScript directly into the payment page with another script. So when we go into the dashboard, on our page protection product, you can basically add origins, which are payment pages. In the case of a single page application, this is actually the entire app. And then once that's done, we give you another script that can be pretty easily just injected into the payment page itself. When this script is added to the payment page, you'll see here, this is a pretty standard HTML page. It's the same one that was served up in the browser. But once we add the script to the very top, what it actually does is it's hijacking and rewriting all of the JavaScript script loads through Evervault secure CDN effectively. So once we create and deploy this to production, without any other changes to the application itself, we'll be serving up JavaScript that's served from Evervault's PCI compliant origin, and then script changes will be automatically tracked. So if we inspect the source code, you'll see here that the script itself is loaded as we put into the HTML page, but some of the other scripts like the Hotjar JavaScript file is being proxied through the CDN itself without having to actually change how the scripts are implemented in the code itself. There's no material changes to the functionality of the application. Otherwise, the same JavaScript is being served up to the browsers, so everything still runs as normal, but it even picks up on the kind of slightly complicated Hotjar example here. So when we go into the dashboard, we'll see that we're already observing all of the scripts that are loading, all of the header changes and so on. So we'll see we've got Hotjar here, we've got the Evervault SDK, and then we assign severities to certain script changes based on how high risk they are, alongside inventory management as well, where you can add justification for why the script is there. And then when you're going into audit season every year, or when you're completing your SAQ, you have this inventory ready to go, and you can export that to a spreadsheet for your QSA, as well as tracking header changes as well. So you can track all this stuff. This is how we're approaching it. I do think, from a pricing perspective, there's a bunch of things to figure out there, especially if you're a high traffic site. The biggest thing here is that you don't need SRI. You can just manage everything kind of dynamically, where the script itself is automatically being just proxied through, and then we do script diffs, and without trying to kind of create noise for security ops teams, we'll just alert you if something actually looks suspicious. Some things aren't suspicious, maybe it's just a styling change or something similar, but certainly some of the more sophisticated attacks, like adding in new form fields, or maybe kind of adding in a new third-party script or third-party origin that you're sending data to, that's a big problem. And so minimizing alert fatigue is a big thing, especially because in the requirement, it says that this needs to be done at least weekly. Weekly is kind of that weird time window where, it's probably just long enough that you could do it manually if you really wanted to have somebody kind of going through every week and combing through the payment pages. But if you're doing weekly, in our opinion, doing it in real time is probably better, because you're going to catch this stuff a lot quicker, especially for a high traffic site. 2 minutes or 5 minutes of being breached is already a pretty big problem, especially at $4 to $18 per card breached as a fine. So we're kind of nearing the end. I'll hand back to John just to kind of run through some kind of practical tips on how we think the best, or what we think the best approaches for complying with 643 and 1161 are.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, very useful. So I think the big takeaways here are people are going to have to do, in the vast majority of cases, something to satisfy being able to demonstrate that they are managing the script security risk on the client side, whether that is 643, 1161 in some form or other, or getting that assurance from their third-party provider, something that's just going to have to happen for the vast majority of organizations. And I think that meeting SAQ eligibility can be done in a number of ways, not just, I don't think, as Sean said as well, he's seeing on the call face, and Shane mentioned from a dev perspective, you just don't think SRI is going to work, which, having read the standard from its infancy for version 4, I think was probably the end game that they were trying to achieve. And then they've just realized too late that SRI is just not going to work for a modern stack. I think CSP as a baseline is a great idea for everybody. It's not that complicated to set up. You can start it off with just reporting and then move it to a blocking mode after you understand what your patterns look like. Script headers and diffs feel like a way to achieve the rest of those compliance requirements, particularly if you're using an inventory as part of that whole process as well. And I think really critically, with the people moving forward with these requirements, early engagement with your QSAs and your acquirers, specifically if you're a merchant, will probably pay dividends in the end. Anytime I've had to be kind of involved in conversations, typically as a QSA on behalf of other clients, when I needed to speak to acquirers, or indeed the breach response people, or the compromise teams in Visa and MasterCard, speaking to them in advance and being kind of upfront and clear with them, giving them clear timelines, means is very much a practice that they appreciate and tend to be a bit more pragmatic in return if you do that. So yeah, those are my key takeaways. Popping up some questions on the actual demo here. If you'd like to answer them, or if you'd like to get in touch, let us know. If anybody has any questions, I think we'll still be answering them in that question tab as well for the next while. So yeah, for me, thank you very much for your time. Hope you got something out of the webinar, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody. We'll still keep answering some of the questions here in the chat. One great question from Adolfo, though, is can you implement CSP for 3DS workflow pages? That's a prime example of where it actually doesn't work, because you've got tens of thousands of potential issuing banks under the hood. So yeah, there are a lot of edge cases where CSP, although it's a pretty powerful tool, it's not going to actually work in a lot of cases.
There is actually an exception for 3DS as well. So in one of the FAQs around this as well, there is an exception for 3DS.
Yeah, it's 1581.
Yeah.
1581. There you go.
There you go.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We will be sending around a quick overview of this. You'll be able to get the recording, and then a lot of the questions will be published online as well if you want to reference them at a later date. But enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks everybody for joining, and good luck before March 31st.